Hello, I'm Dr. Rolando Toyos, and thank you for joining us for another edition of Toyos Talks, where we bring an interesting, educated, informative person to talk about a specific topic. Today, we have the CEO of Melcare in Brisbane, Australia, Anthony Moloney. Melcare develops and manufactures medical honey for products that are used in dry eye disease, chronic sinusitis, dermatitis, wound care. He's been involved in medicinal honey since 1992. His brands are international. Toyos Clinic's been using his Honey Drops Optimel and Optimel ointment successfully for several years now in our dry eye patients. The topic today is medicinal honey. Anthony, thanks for taking the time and being awake early in Australia for us.
Dr. Toyos, lovely to meet, lovely to chat on such an interesting subject. I mean, it's such a historical product to be used therapeutically, and it's probably one of the oldest documented products that we have for clinical use. And if we go back to Egypt, it was recorded nearly 5,000 years ago. It was the main medicine used, particularly in acute and chronic wounds. If we go back to India, in traditional medicine, it's been used in eye care for millennia. So we go back to any culture, whether it's the Middle East, China, India, and in Africa, honey has a long history of use. And it's really such a simple product. And yes, every honey varies according to floral variety, and there's literally thousands. Every tree produces, most trees, flowering trees, produce some sort of nectar. And that nectar, the basic components are all the same: glucose, fructose, sucrose, and organic acids. Then there's other compounds that each floral variety introduces into the honey. And we all know that when we taste honey from whether it be a ground flora or some tree, every honey has a slightly different flavor profile, and that reflects some of the aromatics that come from those different plant sources. So it's a really interesting product. It's really quite simple, but it's also mysterious and has such a long history of use.
Yeah, even and I always quote Hippocrates in all my books, going back to the Greeks, and they have documented where they use honey even to cure eye infections with Plato and Hippocrates. So I think what's going on in medicine and with young doctors that I talk to, it's almost like we're going back to the past. Like patients want more natural ways of healing. They want less of the chemical therapeutics as they would see it. So they're looking for these kind of natural ways of healing. So what got you interested in honey? When people ask me, what got you interested in dry eye, I have a great story. Do you have a great story on how you got interested in honey?
Well, it is. I was approached in about 1995. I was involved in the research of honey for a long time, and involved in the production and manufacturing of honey for a long time, but particularly in honey research and honey science. And the doctor approached me, had a patient with a chronic leg wound, non-healing. It was a venous ulcer, and he came and visited me and said, "Look, I want some honey to put on this wound. Do you have any honey?" And then I said, "Well, why are you interested in honey? I mean, what made you think of using honey?" And he explained to me that in his training, he did his training in the UK, and two of the doctors that were training in the UK were doctors during the Second World War. And they were saying that the only thing they had for bullet and shrapnel wounds in North Africa, and as it turned out, often used in London as well, was a honey. And these beehives in North Africa were guarded, so no one could steal the honey because the honey was used on bullet and shrapnel wounds. And then I guess from that point, I started to look at some of the literature on honey, and honey appeared in literature from the beginning of time, but no one had gone out and said, right, if you're going to do a honey for wound care or eye care, what honey you're going to use and how you're going to prepare it. Because, up to date, people are just taking honey off the shelf or honey from the local hives to use it. And I think it needs a lot more science around it, and how we're going to pack it and produce it and make it usable. So we started to look, and Australia was a good place to start because we have this rich floral variety. We have perhaps more flowering plants than most countries in the world, hundreds and hundreds of different types of honey. So the industry funded a research project to look at honey, and we thought if there's one criteria that's most important, it was antibacterial activity. So we surveyed hundreds of honeys and looking at antibacterial activity and what's most consistent. Now, all honey has an antibacterial activity. It has that because it's got a high sugar content and has a low pH due to the organic acids in there. But one floral variety was quite interesting because it had an unusual or consistent level of antibacterial activity. And so we selected that as the beginning of what we might use for therapeutic use. And that was honey from the Leptospermum species, which is, they evolved in Australia. There's about 93 of them, commonly called Manuka honey. And that's the one that we elected to use in our products. And the next thing was to go to, well, how are we going to prepare that honey for wound care? And there's several steps. One, we had to get the regulators on board to understand, look, back in the 90s, honey was a food and it couldn't be anything else. And so we had to take that and get it past the regulators in terms of how we're going to regulate it, how we're going to sterilize and pack it up so it met the criteria for use in wound care. So that was quite a step. The regulations of it, we were fortunate in Australia, we could go through initially a complementary medicine, then we went to being a medical device. And how you regulate a product all comes down to the therapeutic claims you make about the product. If you make a drug-like claim, then it's got to be a drug. If you make a device-like claim, then it can be a medical device. And so consistent with the claims that we were making, it was a medical device for wound care. Then we had to overlay that with some clinical evidence, and that were control studies. And so we initiated some both. Once we had it in a form that was acceptable for clinical use, and we selected the right floral variety, then once it was regulated, at least as a complementary medicine, we could start doing some clinical trials. And most of the early clinical trials were around chronic wounds. And consistent with what we'd seen in the literature, which hadn't had control studies with any honey, it was profound. Someone with a non-healing venous ulcer, it did so many things that you would have historically had to use a number of products for. It could clean the wounds, it could regulate the pH of wounds, biofilms could be removed, and suddenly these non-healing wounds were going into a healing phase. The other thing I might mention is we started off with pure honey, and the issue with pure honey is quite runny. And then we want to just slightly increase the viscosity of honey. And that's where the Smith papaya for Egypt was really interesting, because they got honey and they mixed it with grease. And that's how they control the viscosity. So when we looked at that, we then looked at what oils and waxes we could use in the honey, and that's how we came up with wound gel. So, it's all about evolution of technology. It's not like suddenly you open the door one day and suddenly it's a brand new idea. Technology tends to evolve. And so what we did with the honey back in the late 90s and early 2000s was no different to what had been done nearly 5,000 years earlier. All we did was use modern materials, modern sterilization techniques. We compounded it with modern technology, and there we have the wound gel. And the wound gel is probably the most widely type of used honey in wound care, and especially whether it be acute wounds or chronic wounds. So that was profound. There was such a how we could have used something that's so old and used it for guidance, and we can go to any pharmacy today and there it is there, exactly what was used nearly 5,000 years ago. And the thing about honey, it's relatively safe, and we can't always say everything is safe, but it has such a long historical use, safe use. And I think what happened that when we got to the Second World War, it was commonly used. Then after the Second World War, we started to see more modern wound care products and drugs, and they sort of put honey into a historical context. It wasn't used, it wasn't current. And
wasn't
so we
sexy.
had this.
I mean, something that's been around for 5,000 years compared to like a pharmaceutical company coming out with something brand new doesn't have that sexy flavor to it.
No. And so it wasn't really until we started doing a series of clinical trials, and then so once we had the wound care product, and then you could mix it into dressings, and it became more accepted. But we still had clinicians saying, going into wound care conferences and saying, well, honey's good for toast, but you don't put it on the wound. So there was a huge prejudice.
Yeah.
And yet I have to say that consumers, or those people with chronic wounds, they were the ones that drove, because they could see the benefit. They were non-healing wounds, nothing was working. It could remove the odor, clean the wounds, and wounds would go into healing phase. But then around about 2005, I was approached by a couple of doctors who they were having issues with chronic dry eye and edema after eye surgery, and they had heard about the use of honey and that we were doing wound care. And so that's when we started to develop the first drops for eye care. And the first clinical trial was in 2005 by Dr. Lee Lenton and Dr. Julie Alberts. And that was looking at the use of honey in chronic dry eye. But I set up a company called MediHoney, and that was a wound care company, and that company ended up being sold, and eye care wasn't important then for them. So I set up Melcare in around about 2009, and our core focus was to be eye care, because we were seeing, just like in chronic wounds, we were seeing a profound benefit, particularly in chronic dry eye, in those patients where they were struggling to manage dry eye. And we created products. We had to design products that would be suitable as an eye drop. I had to pack it, get it regulated, and I had to talk to regulators about how we're going to regulate this product, and get the clinical evidence. And so that story has progressed up until this day, where for those patients with chronic dry eye or edema, post-surgical edema, the honey fulfills a number of roles. So that's how we got to today.
So, and you mentioned it before, because this is all, when I hear about medicinal honey, you always hear about Manuka honey, Manuka honey. Over the years, have you found what's the special ingredient in a Manuka honey as compared to other honeys?
Look, we selected Manuka honey because it gave the most consistent antibacterial activity. And if you're presented with hundreds of honeys and you're going to say, well, I'm going to do a wound care product or an eye care product, which one I'm going to use? Well, you're going to pick the one that has the most consistent properties. And since that time, it is the most researched honey. Is there a magic bullet in Manuka honey? I don't believe so. In the first instance, honey works because it has a low pH to this range of organic acids in it. It's got simple sugars in there, glucose, fructose, and a little bit of sucrose. It's got these humectant properties with low pH. That's the first reason the product works.
Okay.
It helps with cleaning. It helps whether we talk about wound care or the eyelid margin. It helps with cleaning, and it creates this environment, this low pH environment. And while it's not toxic, it is difficult for bacteria to grow. And most bacteria don't like a low pH, or they don't like to have their moisture restricted. And so it's for these very simple reasons that I think we get so much benefit from honey. And I said we selected Manuka or leptospermum honey because it had the most consistent properties.
What about methyl glyoxal, MGO? People talk about that a lot when they talk about medicinal honey. Does Manuka honey have more MGO than some other honeys, or is that not even a factor?
For us, it's not a factor.
Okay.
We use both the USP pharmacopoeia and the British pharmacopoeia. We use standardized antibacterial testing. There's methodology for standardized antibacterial activity testing and challenge testing. That's the criteria, single criteria we use to say, is that honey acceptable or is it not? Does it have this broad range of antibacterial activity, and is it consistent? If yes, then we use it. And all the talk about other components are not critical for us. We just want to know on a petri dish, is it antibacterial activity? Does it have a broad spectrum of antibacterial activity? If yes, that gets used.
And then in terms of doing a little bit of research, is there a hydrogen peroxide part of honey?
There is. So is interesting because it does a number of things. It continually has these enzymes in there which can produce hydrogen peroxide. Is that a critical factor for us? It's not critical. It's important, but not critical, because we come down to this low water activity and low pH as a primary reason for cleaning. Honey also has these other enzymes in there, which helps maintain its pH. And so that's another interesting thing. So when you use it in eye care or in wound care, it maintains its pH. As it gets diluted, it tries to maintain its pH. So it's this really interesting compound, which is quite stable, doesn't like its pH change, has this low water activity. And if you ask me, why does it work? It comes down to those fundamental things: its ability to clean, retain moisture, low pH environment. That's the first thing. That's the first thing that's most important.
And then, I've been talking to patients about orally fixing their gut. And some of the things I talk about is eating foods that have polyphenols, eating foods that have a lot of properties that people are talking about with lifespan, increasing lifespan. So what we're seeing is there's a lot of people working on drops that have antioxidant ability. And what I tell patients is that, we already have something that has some antioxidant ability, and that's honey, and that's honey drops. And then one that's really interesting to me is quercetin, which quercetin is what you find in apples and other foods, but it has a sirtuin activating. It's called a sirtuin activating compound, meaning that it stimulates genes in our body that make our cells work better, and it makes us live longer. So I was very interested when I was doing my research before we got on that honey does have some quercetin in it. So it has a whole bunch of, vitamin B, vitamin C, magnesium, potassium. It has all of these things. So, I mean, it's extra. Not only do you get what you're talking about, but you're getting all these other things which people are trying to make into drops. There's people trying to make a vitamin C drop and a quercetin drop and all this other stuff. And we have it. We already have it. So I don't know if you've ever done any research on that or looked at that at all, but it's kind of an interesting avenue.
We certainly have tried to understand what's in honey. There's literally hundreds of compounds in the honey, and then those compounds can vary slightly according to the floral source. So it's really interesting. And then the bees then add their own enzymes into the honey as well. So it's hugely complex, and we have honeys that are water white and the honeys that are dark like treacle, and the darker honeys tend to have the better antioxidant properties. But it is a hugely interesting area, and we've been on discovery projects where we try and look at new molecules within the honey. But we have a lot to learn, and I guess our focus clinically is really those fundamental, low pH, low water activity, producing a consistent product and getting the clinical evidence around that product.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of discovery that could be done.
Yeah, no, I think in the future we're going to find that there's more to this than meets the eye. I didn't mean to say that, but there's more to this. There's more to this honey than we know. What do you think about oral honey? Because I do recommend oral honey to my patients, especially during allergy season. Do you have any info on that, or any insight into taking oral honey? I know you do nasal sprays and other things, so for allergy. So what is the thoughts there?
Well, a couple of things really. Well, first of all, we know that patients are having a radiation treatment in the mouth and throat, who get dry throat, that the honey provides great relief. So and we use it as a nasal spray and we use it as a throat spray. So it's certainly, the clinical evidence around it as for example, as a cough syrup is really strong, especially in children. How it works, I mean, in the first instance, I think it provides this low pH coating of the ocular surface, so of the mucosa, and it certainly provides relief. In the gut, it's hard to say. We don't have enough clinical evidence to understand how it works in the gut, how it might affect your biome. So I think that's probably lacking in research. There's been a lot of interest in looking at antibacterial activity, or what is Manuka honey, and we know a lot about it, how we may use it clinically in eye care and in wound care and in nasal care, but we don't know much about how it evolves in the gut, what's happening in the gut. And I guess that's I mean, I'd love to see that. I think, we still so much, people are spending a lot of money to buy honey off the shelf. And I think it's an obligation on the industry to start substantiating why we're paying so much honey on the shelf and what's it doing in the gut. I think that's the next opportunity.
Yeah. And then how did you come up with finding out about the throat and nasal spray, that it was helping patients?
Again, that's a traditional thing, isn't it? Because, how often are we told to have if you have a cough or sore throat, have some honey and lemon.
Yeah.
And so it really has evolved from that. And the clinical evidence is pretty good on it. And so, again, we look to the past to find out what we can use now. And, we've got so many exotic pharmaceutical compounds we could use, but I think we need to go back to basics. We know it's relevant, it's non-toxic, long history of safe use. Why wouldn't we use that in the first instance? And then if it gets complicated, go the next step. So how do I know about it? It's because our parents used it and their parents used it.
Yeah.
And that's why we did it. And, so there's no, I love the way technology evolves. There's no profound change. It's just an evolution, and, and producing products for purpose. So, honey on the shelf in a jar, in a food counter, is never going to be used suitable for eye care. You have to take that and present it.
And I have patients that have tried that.
Yeah. You can't,
what are you doing? Don't do that.
No, because it's not standardized. It's got a whole range of stable bacteria in there that have to be removed. So you've got to do lots of things to it to make sure it's suitable for eye care or suitable for wound care.
Yeah. And then, so when we're dealing with a natural product, and I think you kind of answered this, but I just want to emphasize it. Can it change from year to year, since we're, as the environment changes? Will the Manuka honey change from year to year, or is there testing that happens from year to year, or is it pretty stable?
No, look, whether you have fires, you have a drought, you have a wet year, high humidity, low humidity, all that has an impact on the floral variety. So, probably we need to have a look at beekeeping. So how do we get Manuka honey? So beekeepers are migratory. So as in the US and every country, different plants flower at different times of the year, whether it be early spring, late autumn. So every plant tends to have a time of year they flower. And not only that, if we look at woodlands, plants tend to be geographically located. We'll find one species of plant on the eastern ranges, another species of plants on the tableland, another one on the coastal plains. And so for the Manuka that we get, it tends to grow on the coastal plains, and it flowers around September. One species flowers around September, October every year. So the beekeepers, being migratory, they'll take their hundreds of hives and they know, look, there's Manuka flowering on the coastal plains. They'll take their hives in their trucks, go to the coastal plains and leave the hives there for a couple of weeks or a month or a month and a half. And then those bees are only working that flower. Now, when they come to extract the honey, they also know from that where the honey comes. They know, one, that's only that plant that's flowering. Secondly, when they're extracting it, it's quite obvious what floral variety it is. It's just like drinking, a Chardonnay or a Shiraz. You know the grape variety. You certainly know what the variety of the honey is. And then we get it, and so if you take any of our products, any eye drop product, we know exactly what beekeepers put their honey in it. So we trace it, and then we test it for standardization. It has to comply to a whole range of standards before we accept it. So as a long answer to your question, but yes, it does vary every year, and we have to test it. Every batch, every beekeeper that produces the honey, we test it to make sure it complies with what we require. And as I mentioned, beekeepers are migratory, so they'll be working the coastal plains in September. They may go, 500, 1,000 kilometers inland to get some other honey. So they move the hives around all year.
Yeah. Have you ever had a problem of low honey production for a year or anything like that?
Look, we don't, because we don't use a lot of it, but there are years, it's not always the same. Honey production can vary dramatically. If it's a dry year, drought year, honey production drops down dramatically. And so we would normally have, at least a year's honey in reserve. And relative to how much goes into jars, we're just taking the cream of the honey. So yes, we do have to cover ourselves, and we've got the opportunity to get honey from either from Australia or from New Zealand.
And then I'm going to come back to some real questions. This is, do you take oral honey yourself?
Oh yes, we do. So we have our own hives. We have our family has hives,
Yeah.
and it's to great delight that we go and extract it, because the honey has this. If you take honey straight from a beehive, it's really florally. It's just beautiful, and look, we have a brush box here, and we have other flowers or a tea tree, and they all have very distinct honeys.
Yeah.
And so it's lovely. We get white honeys, and we get dark honeys, and in between.
So one of my optometrists is a beekeeper, so she brings me her local honey. So I have that every morning with my tea. So I practice what I preach, but I think there's medicinal purposes in oral honey. I'm hoping it's going to keep me young. Seems like it's keeping you young. You don't look like you've aged since I've met you. So I think you kind of told me, you answered this other question I had, is how you went from wound care to eye care. And thank goodness those doctors approached you, because we've come up with a great product. You had a study where you compared, and this is what I like about what you've been doing, is that you've always been science-backed. You had a research study where you compared Optimel to conventional lubricants. Can you tell us a little bit about that study and what you guys found?
Look, there have been a number of studies comparing against conventional lubricants. The thing we find about with the honey is that one, it's fairly fast. It's fast acting. Secondly, it reduces dependency on normal lubricants. And for those with a chronic condition, it can be really profound. So when you use a standardized lubricant, it's not really it's managing the symptoms, but not necessarily improving the condition. The thing about the honey is that it can improve the symptoms. It's doing more than just the lubricant. And so we make the distinction. We're not a drug, and we're not a lubricant. We fit in the middle, where people with chronic conditions can have it improves their life in terms of helping manage their condition, reducing dependency on lubricants day to day. And you would see from your own observations of patients that how rapid the improvement can be.
Yeah. No, I tell people all the time, I have drops sent to me all the time. Try this, try that with your patients. And, we have so many dry eye patients that we could pretty rapidly see what's working and what's not working. And I do consider Optimel more therapeutic than an artificial tear, which could be washing away, may feel good for a second, but could be washing away the natural molecules that your body needs to combat bacteria, for anti-inflammatory purposes, to feed the glands to work better. So I do consider it more therapeutic than just a lubricant. I actually don't like lubricants at all. I think it's a path that you're washing away the good stuff that if you are producing some tier that you need. So we want to replace that, and I'd rather replace that with something that's more therapeutic than just kind of a lubricant. And the honey, just thinking about it, it kind of it makes a mesh on the eye where you don't really have to use it 5 or 6 times a day like people are using their lubricants, because it does stay on the eye because it's a little bit thicker. Now, what would you say if I get this question all the time, the difference between Optimel drops and Optimel ointment?
Clinically, they're very similar. If we look at the clinical evidence for both products, they're quite similar. The thing about the gel, it tends to linger longer on the eyelid margin. The drops are very convenient to use during the day, and the gel tends to linger longer. So someone who has difficulty at nighttime, or they're waking up with glued eyelids, the gel is great before bed or first up in the morning, and the drops are very convenient to use during the day. And so that's how we tend to distinguish them. Some people like the gel because there's no preservative in it, but it's ideal for nighttime, and the drops during the day. In talking about the preservative in the drops, it's unlike any preservative in drops that you conventionally buy. It's very similar to a compound that naturally occurs in honey anyhow, and occurs in fruit and vegetables, particularly berries. And that's the preservative we use in the drops. But the gel doesn't have any preservative at all.
And is it because the concentration is higher in the gel than in the drop is why you don't need a preservative?
Yeah, well, honey's a natural preservative. So
Yeah.
honey concentration in the gel's at 98%, and in the drops it's 16.5%. And it's just a balance between how much it stings and being convenient to use. So the drops sting because we have these natural organic acids from the honey, and so the drops have or both products have a lower pH. The organic acids aren't very strong, but they do give an initial sting, and it quickly dissipates because when you take the drops, you will tear up, and it suddenly dilutes the drops or the gel, and your eyes generally within a minute will feel really comfortable. And that's probably the comment we get the most. It's like a silk sheet across your eyes. Once you've taken them, within a minute, your eyes feel really nice.
Yeah. One of the things that we found in dry eye patients is that their natural tear pH is lower than what you would find in a normal patient. So a lot of drops sting because they already have an acidic environment that they're kind of dealing with. One of the ways that I found this out is there was a drop that had a pH of like 8 that we were using in cataract surgery. And a lot of my dry eye patients said, oh, this drop feels great when I first put it in. And I realized that they were just balancing out this negative pH that they had on their tear film with this more basic pH in the drop that they were using. So that's what I explained to my patients in terms of the low pH. And that's why it stings, because a lot of them will wonder, is this hurting my eye or anything like that? And I just basically tell them, close their eyes, that pH will stabilize, and then it'll feel great. So we have to always kind of cross that barrier with patients and tell them that the stinging is natural, and we would expect that with anything with a low pH that we're putting in our eye.
Yes, that's important for patients to understand that the sting can be surprise patients, but if they're explained why it stings and that it's normal, then I think it's much better accepted. And it doesn't last very long. It goes away fairly quickly, and it's just those natural organic acids in the honey. And same in wound care. So if you put the honey onto an open acute wound, it'll sting as well.
Is there anybody who would not be a candidate for Optimel drops?
It's more the case of the patient, because there's so many the nature of chronic dry eye and patients that might have inflammatory conditions. You can never be 100% sure how they may react, but on the whole, there's really good patient acceptance, and it's really rare to find someone that can't tolerate it or has any form of reaction. I'm just mindful that if someone already has a natural, if having an inflammatory response, whether they maybe become more sensitive for a short period of time, and patients, I guess, will know very quickly whether, if the sting is not going away within a minute and their eyes are red after 5 minutes, then you say, look, this is not the product for you, or certainly not at this time, at least anyhow. You may like to try it later on.
Now, if somebody has an allergy to, let's say, an American honey, would that be a cross of honey, Manuka honey? Is there certain honeys that are more inflammatory or more allergic than other honeys, or is Manuka honey different? So if somebody comes to me and say, yeah, I tried honey orally one time and I had a reaction to it, does that mean that they're going to be allergic to all honeys? Or is it
That's really hard.
regionally dependent?
That's hard to say. There are certainly toxic honeys in some countries, but if they have an oral allergy to honey, that's probably due to the pollen, most likely. And I would say, look, it's the work hasn't been done. I couldn't say that, look, one honey is more or less likely than another honey. But I can say is that the most clinical evidence we have is certainly on leptospermum honey, on the Manuka honey. And so if you're going to use a honey, you pick the one that's got the most clinical evidence on.
Now, is bee pollen taken out of the Optimel?
No. Look, it's substantially removed, but we can't say that it's all removed. To take every bit of pollen out of it, you'll start to denature the honey. It's quite a complex process. So we take substantially all of it out, but we couldn't be assured that it's all gone. It's pollen comes in so many sizes, and it's so small. So no.
So this is a specific honey question. Is propolis pollen? What is propolis?
Propolis is we call it bee glue. And so the bees, when they've got a hole in the hive or some damage somewhere, they'll produce this hard, waxy substance to patch it up. So if there was some hole they didn't want inside of the hive, they would use propolis to glue it up, to seal it up. So it's an interesting compound itself, and we often get asked the question, well, why don't we look at propolis extract, or why don't we look at royal jelly? They're hugely complex substances, and for us, it just overcomplicates it for the moment. It's interesting, and people have used those products for a long time, but we stick with what we know well, and that's for research for another time, because as I said, they are interesting, but they're not for us at this time.
Now, is propolis in Optimel?
No, we don't add it in. No, we don't certainly add it in. It's unless incidentally, as I said, it's a very hard, waxy product, and we use just pure honey, and any particulate matter that's in the honey we remove as far as possible.
Yeah. Is there anything that's more that you're taking out that when you're doing this process of the Optimel, some of the things that you're taking out that you found are not good for the skin, the eye, the nose? Like you said in the beginning that there's a process that you put the honey through. Is there what significant things are you taking out when you do that process?
So when in the process of extracting the honey, the beekeepers remove the caps from the bee cells, and they put them into a centrifuge and spin the honey out. And when it comes out, it can come out with mostly bits of wax from the frame. And so the process of getting the honey to us is to remove all that particulate matter, the bits of wax, maybe there's insect parts in there, and most of the pollen. So that's all we remove from the honey. And then the other thing we try and do, we avoid heating the honey too much. We have a discipline of not overheating the honey. We want it to be as natural as possible. with a minimum of changes to it. So if you heat honey, as you heat it, it's changing, subtly changing the whole time. Enzymes are denatured, some of the aromatics are lost. And that's why when we have a bottle of honey from the shelf, or we go and try honey from a neighbor's hive, they never taste the same because the bottle on the shelf has been blended and heated and treated. Where the honey from the hive next door is natural as possible. You know, it has all the beautiful aromatic notes. And so we're very conscious that on one hand, we've got to have a really pure product, but on the other hand, we don't want to mess it up too much before we put in our product. So this is fine balance.
Yeah, that's excellent. All right, so what's next for Melcare? And it doesn't have to necessarily be the eye. What do you got cooking in the back of your brain?
Well, we're going to do more around nasal sprays because we get such a good response on nasal on chronic rhinosinusitis. And we know that patients, well, there's two things. Patients with chronic dry eye often have chronic sinus problems, and they can have chronic skin problems.
Yep.
So they're the areas that we are really interested in. So focus will be, we do a bit on wound care, but focus is on those chronic diseases, chronic skin conditions, chronic rhinosinusitis, cough syrups. We've got working on another eye drop, but it's all a derivation of what we currently do. So nothing profound change, but really in our areas of competence around the mucosa, eye care, skin care, and using what the attributes of honey we know about. That is, it's low water activity, it's low pH, and that has application on the skin, on the mucosa, nasal cavity. We're very interested in anti-inflammatory properties. That's really a separate series of studies that we're doing.
Yeah. And just so I have this on video, next time I come in your area, you're going to have to let me taste some of the honey at your own honey hive.
I would absolutely love to. I mean,
Well, it's been
it's
great.
beautiful.
It's been great having you. You know what? I thought I knew a lot. Now I know a lot more. These are all kind of questions that my patients ask me as well. This is not just me. So I'm glad we had this opportunity to kind of talk to the man in terms of all about honey. And I feel like I know so much more now than I did before, which helps me in prescribing this or giving it to my patients to help them. But you've helped a lot of patients. You should be very proud of that. I could tell you just from my experience with it. And thanks for coming on Toyos Talks.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.